My name's Andy Cook and I'm part of the sports psychology team here in the School of Sport, Health and Exercise Sciences. So I'm a member of the Institute for the Psychology of Elite Performance. That's our psychology research group. And in the next 15 minutes, hopefully maximum, I'm just going to give you a little flavour of the sorts of topics that you might cover, especially with me in the sports psychology area, if you were to come here to Bangor. But before I do that, I just wanted to do a little, hopefully very simple recognition test for some of the applicants. So any of the applicants here, can you give me a nod if you're familiar with this model, if you've seen it on any of your A-level or B-Tech, if you've heard your teachers talk about this? A few nods. Okay, so that's not a surprise to me because I teach year one psychology and I teach a little bit about this, and I know that lots of students recognise this from A-levels, from B-Techs. For anyone who isn't familiar, this is the catastrophe model that explains the relationship between anxiety, arousal and performance. And it's one of the most dominant perspectives in the sports psychology literature, and it's used to explain or model particularly when athletes might choke under pressure, so when things might go spectacularly wrong. It's a really famous model that's taught across the world in sports psychology at high schools at university level. What you might not know is that that model was actually created here in Bangor. In the late 80s and early 90s, Professor Lou Hardy, who was one of the first professors of sports psychology in the UK and a former head of this department, actually created that model. And I wanted to show you that just to give you a bit of context about when Jamie says this department having a long and proud history in sports science and sports psychology. That really is true. In the 1990s, this research was being done here that now is being delivered across the country and across the world here. So we're really proud of that, and the stuff that we do today is still with that same endeavour of being at the cutting edge and teaching the stuff that is going to be, delivered in the textbooks in 20, 30 years' time. So while you'll learn about that, and you'll learn about lots of other common areas of sports psychology, things like psychological skills training, personality, goal setting, imagery, the sorts of stuff that you might have encountered a little bit at A-level, you will of course learn that here, and we've got experts in those areas that will deliver those sorts of content to you. What I'm going to talk about today is a little bit of an introduction to my world. So I'm a psychophysiologist, and this is a relatively new branch of sports psychology. And the reason I wanted to talk about this, it's what I get excited about, it's my niche research area, but it's also something that isn't widely available across other institutes. So this is something that actually might be a little bit different if you come and study here, give you a different experience to what you might get elsewhere. Has anyone encountered this term before, by the way? Familiar to anyone from A-levels or B-Techs, psychophysiology? So it kind of is what it says on the tin, really. It's an interdisciplinary branch of sports psychology that uses objective physiological measures to try and understand psychological questions. So for instance, this is an image of a research participant, one of my study participants in the laboratory. He's hitting golf putts, but while he's doing that, we're simultaneously measuring his brain waves. We're measuring his cardiovascular activity, his breathing rate. We've got sensors on his arms to measure his muscle tension, and we've got various sensors in the golf club to measure his grip force, his swing velocity, things like that, to give us a really rich insight into what's going on when he's hitting these putts. Now that's interesting to me because it can answer some really important questions. When we adopt this real interdisciplinary approach, we can start to understand how these things evolve as we transition from a beginner to an expert, for instance. How do our brainwaves change as we become proficient at a motor skill? We know that sometimes when athletes are under pressure, things can go wrong. By taking this approach, this whole body psychophysiological approach, we can understand what is likely to go wrong to cause them to fail. Does pressure alter their brainwaves? Does it alter their muscular tension, for instance? And when we've answered those questions, this is the exciting bit, as sports psychologists, we can start to develop niche interventions to help ensure that these athletes, when they're in those pressured situations, to help ensure that they don't fail and actually they thrive and achieve their personal bests. And so for the remainder of this session, I'm going to talk about one specific technique that I've been developing over the last 10 years now as part of my research program, which involves training athletes to control their brain waves. That's known as neurofeedback training for the brain. And we've developed this technique, and it's something we're leading on here in Bangor, based on our previous research showing that patterns of brainwaves are really important for athletes when they perform. And the whole goal of neurofeedback training is helping an athlete to recognise when they're producing the pattern of brainwaves that is consistent with their optimal performance. Help them recognise when they're producing that pattern and help them consistently produce it when they're in those pressured moments. So in essence, helping them ensure that they're always in the zone when it matters most. So you might wonder, how do you train somebody to control their brainwaves? Sounds a bit wacky, right? Well, I'll give you an example with heart rate monitors. I'm sure lots of you will have had an experience at some point where you've worn one of these trackers that measures your heart rate, a fitness tracker, something like that. So if you imagine when you're not wearing that device on your wrist or wherever it might be quite difficult to know with certainty at any moment in time how fast your heart is beating. But when you wear that device, you can look at it, it can tell you your heart rate, and actually you can figure out pretty quickly, okay, if I take some slow, deep breaths, my heart rate will go down a little bit. If I hold my breath, perhaps tense up a little bit, my heart rate will increase. Well, we adopt exactly the same principle with neurofeedback training or brain training. We use sensors that we place on people's scalp to record their brain waves, and then we display their brain waves back to them in real time via computer software. So, wireless technology like this, one of these caps with wireless sensors in, will transmit via Bluetooth to a computer package that can then display an athlete's brainwaves back to them in real time. When we do that, people can actually learn really quite quickly, amazingly quickly in fact, how with their thought process they can either increase or decrease activation on certain parts of their scalp. And that's potentially really exciting and important for sport. So, again, you still might be thinking this seems quite a wacky, abstract concept. So let me give you a video to try and illustrate that. So this is a video with some croquet players actually, and this is in our motion analysis lab, which is just at the bottom of the hill there. You might not have seen that, but we have some more laboratories here in Bangor, as well as the ones that you've seen on this tour. So this is our motion analysis laboratory, and you'll see this athlete's brainwaves on the screen behind him, but you'll also hear an auditory tone. And what he's trying to do is silence that tone. Because when he silences that tone, that's the computer software telling him that he's in the zone. He's producing the right patterns of brainwaves. When he does that, that's when he hits his shot. So he makes it go quiet, and then he hits his shot. And it's this idea of actually training athletes to recognise how to produce those states and then associate being in the zone with actually hitting the shot. Now that was a video that we made a couple of years ago, just a mocked up video with some croquet players. We were doing a training session. This wasn't a scientific study. I did do a scientific study using that exact approach about 10 years ago now with a sample of golfers, and this was one of the very first sport neurofeedback studies to be done anywhere. And what we found was that relatively quickly these golfers learned to control their patterns of brain activity, and we also showed that this had some benefits for their performance. Are there any golfers in here? No? Well, this sort of training was beneficial for these golfers in this particular study. And this was one of the first studies, as I say, it was a pioneering study in some regards, and it's since been replicated in other laboratories. And as a consequence of that, the research that we're doing in universities like this is now being used by elite athletes. And to give you an example in the sport of golf, so this is Justin Rose, current world number 10, former major champion, top British golfer.
Justin Rose is one of the world's leading golfers.
That's the hat I wear. So what this is basically like an EEG reading of my brain, left brain, right brain. It basically tells me if I'm being creative or analytical. So this is what I train with. So when I'm training my routines, I'm trying to, so we're getting basically feedback, digital feedback on my app to say, okay, yeah, I'm in the sweet spot, or no, I'm being too creative. What was that thought? What you think you like too analytical? So for me, this is even more important around the greens. Chipping and putting is where I feel like this is really, really key for me. I want to paint a picture, I want to see it, I want to react to it. And the guy who's coaching me can say it. Oh, what happened halfway through that routine? I'm like, yeah, I looked down, I just felt like I wasn't really trusting my alignment. And so we're getting that real feedback now.
So what you saw in his hat there, that's how the technology's come on. But as a result of research like the stuff that we're leading on here in Bangor in the laboratory, then sports companies develop this user-friendly technology that the elite athletes are now using to help enhance their performance at the very top of world sport. So that's just a very short flavour of an introduction to neurofeedback, if you like. You'll learn much more about that research when you come here. What I'm going to do for the remaining 5 minutes or so is I'm just going to talk briefly about 2 actual student projects using neurofeedback that have been conducted here, because as well as learning about the research that we as staff do when you come here, an important part of the degree programme is that you guys will also get the opportunity to lead your own research project in year 2 and especially in year 3, the final year of your degree. And actually, some of our students do some really, really cutting-edge research that results in publications in leading scientific journals, and we're really quite proud of that. So to show you, not only will you learn about this sort of stuff, you also have an opportunity to do projects using this technology. And one such project was supervised by myself, by Anthony, who's led you on some of the laboratory tours, and James Hardy, another member of staff here. So this was a couple of years ago now. We were approached initially by a student, Sophie, who was interested in neurofeedback training. She was also interested in cycling. And so we agreed to supervise a project in that area. And we set her off with the task of looking at the neuroscience literature and identifying a candidate pattern of brainwaves that might be beneficial for cyclists. And the 4 of us sat in the room, she fed back her research, and we came up, without going into too much technical detail, with a hypothesis that if we train people to increase relative left frontal brain activity, that might be beneficial for endurance exercise like cycling, because it's associated with more positive feeling. It might delay this urge to withdraw that can sometimes happen when you're in painful endurance exercise situations. So we went with that hypothesis, and she went away to run an experiment to actually test this. 39 student cyclists, they had 12 minutes of neurofeedback training immediately before they get on the bike. Some of them were trained to increase left frontal activity, some of them were trained to increase activity in their right frontal regions, and some of them received no training at all. And what we found, which we were quite staggered by, was that the people who were trained to increase their left frontal activity, their endurance was prolonged by about 30%. It was a really amazing finding from a student-led project. And since then, we've actually, last year with another student, Francesca, we've actually replicated this and shown similar effects. We're really excited by these findings, and these are kind of secret findings in a way, because they're not out there yet, they're not public domain. These are student project-led findings. But these will be published in an international journal in the near future, and I predict that they'll actually make quite a big impact in the cycling and endurance sport communities. And just to give you an example of the sort of cutting-edge research that you as students could be doing if you come here. with us. One final project that I'm going to talk about, I realise that I've talked a lot about sport now, and we're in a sports science department, but I know that some of you are interested in more health and rehabilitation, and actually I'm interested in that too. And neurofeedback is a nice area because it's not limited to sport, it's something that you can apply in lots of different domains. So very briefly, this was another student project that I supervised last year. Amanpreet Sidhu, she came to me, she was interested in neurofeedback training, but she was also interested in movement rehabilitation. A similar pattern to what I described before with the project with Sophie and Francesca. So I set Amanpreet off with the task of going and looking into the neuroscience literature, identifying candidate patterns of brainwaves that might be helpful in a rehabilitation context. And what we decided to do was to have people do what's actually quite a common clinical test. Some of you might have seen it before. It's used a lot to assess movement, balance, functionality, especially in conditions like Parkinson's disease after stroke, for instance. It's called the timed up and go test, where people basically have to get up from a chair, walk 3 meters around a cone, return and sit down again. And it's a very well used test in hospitals, in clinical settings. So we decided to have people do this test, but to do this test while they were wearing a leg brace to actually immobilise their knee joints. And the reason we did that was to try and de-automise their natural fluid gait, their normal motor skill, akin to what might happen when you have to relearn a movement with a slightly different technique because of an injury, for instance. And we reasoned that if we train people to actually increase activation over their locomotion brain circuits, over these central areas that control gait, this might be beneficial for them. And again, this was exactly what we found. There was around a 6% improvement in gait speed for the people who underwent this training compared to people who didn't undergo neurofeedback training or who received an opposite kind of neurofeedback training. And again, this is kind of a secret finding because nobody's really seen this yet because it's not published. But this will be published, it will be submitted for publication to an international journal very, very shortly. And again, I'm really excited by the potential of this. Again, a student-led project that might have some real impact in the scientific community. So to wrap up and give you some things to go home with, hopefully you might recognise these terms now, psychophysiology, this new interdisciplinary branch of sports psychology, and neurofeedback as a way of actually training brainwaves, a new tool that sports psychologists, that practitioners in rehabilitation settings might be able to use to improve motor performance. Especially, I talked about these because, I believe that these are things that we do especially well here in Bangor, and in line with what Jamie said about us always striving to be at the front of the research discipline, to take calculated risks. These are research areas that aren't widely covered across other universities. Feel free, if you visit other universities, if you're interested in this, to look at their curriculums. Some might have some coverage of this, but it's by no means widespread across other universities yet, but it's something that we're quite proud to, I guess, lead on here. And finally, I'd like to hope that some of you might be able to recognise to a certain extent now that what Jamie said about this being a well-established leading department, it really, we believe that. We really think that we've helped to shape sports psychology as a discipline from that early work in the 1990s, and hopefully we're still doing that today with this new novel research that isn't being done so much elsewhere. And if you guys were to come here, then hopefully that would help go some way to future-proofing your career, because you'd be doing stuff that is going to become normal in 10 years' time, but perhaps isn't everywhere now. So thanks very much, Diolch yn fawr, for your attention.